Hello and welcome to this course on corporate governance. It's going to be a long journey, I warn you, and we're going to go through almost all the elements of corporate governance that one can think of. We're going to start from an introduction to corporate governance, what corporate governance is, and then move swiftly on to some of the theories, the academic theories about firms and corporations and ownership. And almost everything that follows is around this central concept of ownership. So Unit 1 and Unit 2 really set a foundation for the rest of the things that we're going to discuss. Unit 3 then goes on to a really interesting exploration of the role of legal systems and the law in corporate governance and ultimately economic growth. In Unit 4, we'll be taking a trip around the world and looking at corporate governance in different countries. Unit 5, we'll be talking about board composition and the role of independent directors versus in-house directors, director compensation, and the market that's growing for independent directors. In Unit 6, we'll be tackling the somewhat thorny issue of CEO compensation and discussing the different ways that CEOs can be compensated for their work. In Unit 7, we'll be talking about international corporate governance and how corporate governance guidelines need to be internationalized, especially in view of the trends towards, or the increasing trend towards, globalization. We'll finish with Unit 8, where we'll be looking at an overview of corporate governance codes, as well as chatting about some of my experiences on boards. This is such an important topic, and I really hope that you enjoy discussing it with me. I hope you enjoy watching this video, and I hope that I can have further discussions in the comments about this topic. Without further ado, let's move on to Unit 1, Introduction to Corporate Governance. Corporate governance, according to Schleifer and Vishny, I hope I pronounced their names properly, who are sort of the academics that are most prominent in writings about corporate governance. They define corporate governance quite simply as corporate governance refers to the ways suppliers of finance to corporations assure themselves of getting a return on their investment. So basically, how they define corporate governance is how investors get their money back. Really simple. The World Council for Corporate Governance takes on a more holistic perspective. It says that corporate governance is concerned with the systems of laws, regulations, and practices which will promote enterprise, ensure accountability, and trigger performance. And I think that this is a more all-encompassing view of corporate governance. McGill and Patel give a much longer and even more holistic view of corporate governance. And I like what they say about corporate governance because it touches on almost every area. It says that corporate governance deals with the rights and responsibility of a company's management, its board, shareholders, and various stakeholders. How well companies are run affects market confidence as well as company performance. Good corporate governance is therefore essential for companies that want to access capital and for countries that want to stimulate private sector investment. If companies are well run, they will prosper. This in turn will enable them to attract investors whose support can help them to finance faster growth. Poor corporate governance, on the other hand, weakens a company's potential and at worst can pave the way for financial difficulties and even fraud. And my favorite line in this definition is around the effect that corporate governance has on countries. And I'll be going back to this because I work in Africa and I live in Africa. So one of the more interesting things to me is development finance and how countries can stimulate economic development. So it's interesting that McGill and Patel pointed out that this second paragraph where they say good corporate governance is essential, therefore, for companies that want to access capital, but also for countries that want to stimulate private sector investment. And I think that's very instructive for Nigeria and Africa as a whole. So there are two main approaches to corporate governance, and the literature calls them the institutional approach and the functional approach. I personally have named them, to help me remember, the wide lens approach and the narrow lens approach, or the conservative approach versus the liberal approach. I mean, these are my names for them that help me remember, but the literature refers to them as the institutional approach versus the functional approach. And the institutional approach to corporate governance involves examining the existing institutions to see how they can produce the services that they offer more efficiently. In corporate governance, institutions generally refer to the regulatory, the legal, the financial framework. An institutional approach would therefore look at all these areas individually and see how they could be improved in order to improve governance generally. So more recently, for example, there's been an increasing focus on legal institutions to see how they can be strengthened to protect investors against corporate fraud. A functional approach, however, looks at different institutional arrangements and how they can function in different ways. This type of approach takes the view that there are different ways to address similar governance concerns. It implies a more open-minded approach to examining different possibilities. The core function is to facilitate investment. However, there are many ways by which investment can be facilitated. So I feel like the reason why I call them the wide lens and the narrow lens is because the institutional approach looks at corporate governance through quite a narrow lens. We're only looking at the institutions and looking at how what exists can be improved, whereas the functional is a bit more open-minded and looks at different possibilities. And I feel like that's like a camera lens that's much wider. And the reason why I remember them as a conservative and liberal approach again is because in an institutional approach, it's very conservative. And with the functional approach, it's a bit more liberal. And so that's an aide memoir for me when I think about the two approaches in academia to corporate governance. I have to talk about dispersed and concentrated because these are the two sort of paradigms that will be coming up continually as we go through this module. And we have some interesting case studies about, how these two perspectives can clash. Increased globalization with complex networks of international finance arrangements has deepened the gap between shareholders and management. And there's two ways. So the world seems to be divided into two main systems of corporate governance. Of course, there's some crossover, of course, there's some blurring of the lines, but we see corporate governance structures in two different ways. Number one is the dispersed, and that it involves dispersed ownership of shares with strong shareholder protection. And that's what you see in the UK and the US. The other system is concentrated, typical of many European countries, where you have concentrated blocks of powerful shareholders. They can be individuals but more commonly, there are families, and that is characterized by weaker protection for minority investors. On the subject of ownership, we can see even in the Bible, there were disputes recorded over ownership. This is a picture of Joseph with his technicolored, or what do they call it, dream coat, they call it, or his coat of many colors. And that caused a lot of jealousy in the family because they thought that Joseph was being favored amongst other siblings. And, you know, this concept of ownership is almost as old as time itself, as old as humanity itself. And throughout this module again, you know, this unit is just setting the scene, but throughout this module, we'll keep on coming back to this concept of ownership. So there'll be lots of slides saying back to ownership, and thinking about what it really means to own. So I've spoken about some paradigms, and I hope that you've sort of taken note of them. I've spoken about the functional versus the institutional perspective, and I've spoken about the concept of concentrated shareholder blocks versus dispersed shareholders with strong shareholder protection. And now we're looking a bit more deeply at ownership. And the issue of ownership gets even more complex when you're talking about ownership of shares in a corporation. The ownership of items like a car or a goat or a car, or a house, sorry, a car or a goat or a cow or a house, are relatively simple because you can go outside and you can kind of see your cow if you know you keep it in the garden, and you can drive your car to work because it's yours. However, it's more complex when you buy shares because as a shareholder, you own a fractional share of a corporation. It's basically an intangible interest in an intangible asset. I mean, the company itself has assets, but it's not like you have, like if you own a share in a trucking company, for instance, it's not as if you have one of the tires of the truck in your safe at home saying this is a tangible bit of the business that I can see and touch. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's a legal construct, but you don't have anything that you can actually see or touch usually. The only thing that is certain is your power to transfer, so you can sell that share. And I think that's what makes it real to most people. Minoa Monks, in my opinion, wrote one of the best textbooks ever on corporate governance. It's called Corporate Governance. And one of the things that they talk about is ownership of shares, like a Cheshire cat, the disappearing Cheshire cat in Alice in Wonderland. And I'm going to quote them directly. They say the purchaser of stock considers that he is acquiring an interest in an enterprise. Not so much that he is assuming common relations with numerous other stockholders. For the most part, he doesn't know them and doesn't take the pains to know who they are. If he knows the property and the directors, then he's happy. This has led to a disappearance of ownership in any meaningful sense of the word, like the Cheshire cat. And I think this is an interesting perspective, right? That you buy this stock, but you don't know anybody else that owns the stock. You can't really see it. And what they're saying or what they're quoting is this idea that the meaning of ownership has drastically changed with the advent of the corporation. Adam Smith, one of the greatest economists that ever lived, wrote about 200 years ago against this concept of the corporation. His perspective is that you can't just sell shares, owners can't just sell their shares to random people and then ask more random people to manage the company. He just didn't think it would work. And this is a quote from him. He says the directors of such joint stock companies, however, being the managers of other people's money than their own, it cannot well be expected that they should watch over it with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners in a private co-partnery frequently watch over their own. Like the stewards of rich men, they are apt to consider attention to small matters as not for their master's honour, and very easily give themselves to a dispensation from having it. Negligence and profusion, therefore, must always prevail, more or less, in the managements of such a company. And 200 years ago, before any of the corporate scandals, before Enron, before Theranos, Adam Smith really hits on the source of the problem, which is this idea of separating ownership from control and putting managers who are managing the money of other people in control of that money. And this is the problem that corporate governance aims to solve. Before we move on, I just have to talk about private equity because I play in that space. I run a healthcare investment company and we invest in 3 areas in the healthcare and wellness space. We invest in growth capital, so we do venture capital and private equity, and of course we do infrastructure investing, which we're probably better known for. And private equity really gets a bad reputation. This is a political advert from the American election in 2011 when Mitt Romney was running, and he's quite a famous private equity guy from a company called Bain Capital. And what he said, what the advert attacked him to say, is that there's little question that he made a fortune from the businesses that he helped destroy. And a lot of the rhetoric around Mitt Romney was the fact that the private equity industry destroys jobs and destroys businesses, and they're often seen as wicked people. So in defense of private equity and sort of to shed more light on this concept of ownership, I'd like to quote Henry Kravis, who made this speech at the private equity conference in New York in 2004. And he said that if you examine all the major corporate scandals of the past 25 years, none of them have occurred where there was a private equity firm involved. Now, he's not saying that businesses have failed. Businesses fail in private equity, but it's not due to corruption. And he attributes this to the fact that private equity firms take a majority stake and have to turn around that company towards growth in just 5 years, usually, that kind of time horizon. And I think it's so pertinent what he says. He says, I believe that as genuine partners, we are vigilant in our role as owners and we protect shareholder value. And I just think that this is one of the best sort of demonstrations about the power of a genuine feeling of ownership. And that is what corporate governance is trying to achieve. It's trying to make sure that the managers that are in control of these businesses are aligned with the owners, are aligned with the shareholders, and therefore protect shareholder value and are vigilant in their role as owners. Which leads me nicely on to the concept of ownership and control. It often seems like it was scandals like Enron that made people concerned about corporate governance. But actually, as you can see from Adam Smith's quotes, it's been a concern since the formation of the joint stock company. All the sorts of discussions and frustrations and hand wringing and worries actually focus on this single concept, the separation of ownership, the people that put the money in, from control, the managers that run the company. Burley and Means published the most famous paper in this space on ownership and control. And one of the quotes from their paper says, "The way modern corporations has evolved produced the situation that the interests of owners and managers have diverged." The separation of ownership and control was effectively a separation of the decision-making and risk-bearing functions. So it allows organizations to benefit from specializing in management and in risk-bearing. Separation of ownership and control also meant new expenses for the firm, e.g. monitoring costs, the costs associated with aligning the interests of owners with managers. And much of the study of corporate governance is concerned with how to curtail these costs and improve the alignment of interests between these owners, the money men, and the managers who actually execute the day-to-day running of the company. What is a corporation? We've been speaking about ownership in the context of corporations, but I thought it was really important to actually define a corporation. And Monks and Minnow, you've seen them before, you'll be seeing them throughout this lecture series, is a mechanism established to allow different parties to contribute capital, expertise, and labor for the maximum benefit of all of them. Essential characteristics of a corporation are limited liability, transferability of investor interests, and I think we've mentioned this before, a legal personality, and centralized management. A bit about the history of corporations. In the Middle Ages, they were more like municipalities, towns, universities, monastic orders, etc. And they were collective organizations that represented a way to create a source of wealth and power that was not associated with royal families. So that collective, that structure protected them from the autocracy or the elite. One of the most interesting ways of viewing a corporation is as a nexus of contracts. So the firm is entirely a matter of just contract law and people contracting with each other. And with McDonald's, one of my favorite companies, you can see that, McDonald's is my favorite company because um, it's just so interesting how the story evolved. McDonald's sells 80 hamburgers every single minute. It's a capitalist machine, right? And obviously, you could view McDonald's as a network of contracts with vendors who supply beef and cheese and milkshake, employee contracts that manage to perform this kind of alchemy with McDonald's employees. McDonald's employees are usually teenagers that can't even be trusted to clean their own rooms. And all of a sudden, this sort of capitalist process converts them into people contributing to a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. They're suppliers of capital, suppliers of credit, a whole nexus of different contracts, and that's one academic perspective on what a corporation is. I've mentioned specialization earlier, and what I said in that slide was that it allows one set of people to develop specialization in risk bearing and one set of people to develop specialization in executing. And this was what sort of led to a production or manufacturing revolution, this concept of specialization, the fact that you didn't know how to make the whole product, but somebody would just put wheels on the product, or somebody would just attach legs to the product, or somebody would do a specific thing over and over again, and they got specialized in that particular process without having to make the whole entire product. And in the same way, specialization has played a role in the evolution of the corporation today. It's necessary for the efficient organization of talent, money, and other factors and energies in the pursuit of technological and industrial progress. And I've put a picture of a chair here because investors in a chair factory don't have to have any idea how the chair is made. They can invest their money without knowing the intricacies of the hooks and latches and types of plastic and types of wood. They specialize in giving money to companies, and the company specializes in making chairs. And this specialization is so important for the evolution of the corporation. Recently, there's been an uptick of interest in corporate governance. And I don't know if you recognize her picture. This is Elizabeth Holmes, who is famous or infamous for her blood testing startup, where she raised over $1 billion, I believe it was, for a machine that didn't work. She purportedly or allegedly misled investors, maybe lied to investors to get all this money from startups, from investors, and it didn't work. So corporate governance, because of these scandals, not just at Theranos, which was Elizabeth Holmes' company, but also much larger or much more famous scandals like Enron, for instance, and the global financial crisis, of course, has made people more interested in corporate governance. Globalization and the fact that people are now doing business across borders, again, has made people more interested in global corporate governance. Shareholder activism. I was one of my favorite professors, actually, a professor at NYU, Professor Galloway, wrote a really stinging letter to Jack Dorsey of Twitter. He was a very, very minute shareholder, but he published the letter that he wrote on his social media, and it went viral. And that was a bit of shareholder activism, using his huge social media following to complain about how he was feeling expropriated as a shareholder, even though a minority shareholder in Twitter, and that he felt that Twitter wasn't making any money or making enough money because of the leadership of Jack Dorsey. So, we're seeing a lot more of that, a lot more shareholder activism. And, firms are growing. Global economic growth is moving forward in the post-COVID era, and people want to protect their investments. I'm going to finish off talking about the Asian financial crisis and some of the lessons that it taught us about corporate governance. Weak corporate governance, characterized by cronyism and corruption, distorts the efficient allocation of resources. So it makes economies inefficient. It also distorts competition. And that lack of confidence in the corporate world can actually spread rapidly to the entire economy, hindering investment and economic growth. And for the last bit of this unit, we're really going to look at a more global perspective. I mean, we've been looking almost at firms and sort of individual firms and what they do and the concepts of ownerships. But I want to use the last few slides to really bring this home in terms of, corporate governance and its benefit to economies. And you can see from the Asian financial crisis, poor corporate governance really spooked international investors and probably deepened that crisis in 1997. There are actually a number of ways that it's believed that corporate governance can actually make countries more prosperous. And these include the fact that good corporate governance promotes the efficient use of resources, both within companies and in the wider economy. It helps debt and equity capital flow to the most efficient users. It's capable of the timely replacing of those managers that don't use resources well or are incompetent or corrupt. It helps boost the confidence of both domestic and international investors. And that means that companies can attract lower cost investment capital. It also provides incentives to the board to ensure compliance with laws, regulation, and also societal expectations. Now, just as a caveat, better governance does not guarantee improved performance at the individual firm level, but it does make companies actively respond to changes in the business environment. It's also a check on power of relatively few individuals in a corporation who control large amounts of other people's money. So it reduces the likelihood of corrupt behavior. I'm just going to have a drink of water as we move on to Unit 2. So in Unit 2, we'll be talking about academic theories of the firm mostly, even though we get to talk about some fun stuff to do with venture capital towards the end. At the beginning, we'll mainly be talking academic theory. And then we'll move on to talk about unconventional developments before we talk about VC at the end. And I know that with African startups raising record amounts of money, companies like OPay, Flutterwave, InterSwitch, Kuda Bank, raising these huge amounts of money at quite large valuations. Chatting about venture capital towards the end is the kind of thing that most people will be interested in. But let's get through the boring stuff first. So we've spoken about ownership. We'll keep on coming back to ownership and the fact that owners have two rights. One, control of the firm, and two, ability to appropriate residual earnings and profits. Now, the competition and corporation perspective is an academic way of looking or viewing the firm. The competition perspective takes a black box approach, right? And views companies as a production function that aims solely to make profit. Almost like a soulless institution that's just a black space of nothingness. And I put a picture of Jay-Z here because, there's all these like conspiracy theories, they're quite silly really, around how he must have sold his soul to the devil. But the competition view is a pretty soulless view of the corporation, whereas the corporation view is more interesting to me personally, because the corporation views the company or the corporation as a sort of meeting point of different interest groups to minimize transaction costs. So I find that a bit more human sort of way of looking at it. Another theory that is quite similar to the choice versus contract theory was developed by Olivier Williamson. And he sees the corporation through two lenses, through the science of choice and through the science of contract. And when he looks at choice, again, it's this kind of black box, sort of soulless approach. And when he looks at contracts, he further divides it into private ordering and public ordering. He says that public ordering concerns the rules of the game. So how the corporation actually shapes the environment that it operates in through affairs to do with public finance and political concerns. So more about the non-market strategy, or they call that sort of the politics is a system of complex exchange between individuals, where people seek to collectively secure their own objectives that can't be secured through market exchanges. And I think, that's quite interesting. Whereas the private ordering refers to the play of the game and incentives to deal with the problems of contracting, as well as the implementation of existing contracts. So this is again more about choice versus contracts, and the fact that, in the choice view, it's just an inhuman black box, whereas this contract view is more human, more fun, more flexible. So just briefly to speak about investor-owned firms versus employee-owned firms and consumer-owned firms before we take a bit more of a deep dive into some of these trends. So investor-owned firms tend to be owned by professional investors usually, and they have a smaller degree of sort of a smaller degree of flexibility compared to the employee-owned firms. They tend to be more profit-driven. The employee-owned firms are quite interesting. There's quite a few of them in Italy, and some studies say that actually the employees in employee-owned firms are more motivated because everybody has a piece of the pie. However, the decision-making process is so difficult because they want everybody to be involved and everybody has an opinion. So it takes quite a long time in employee-owned firms to come to a decision. And also those firms find it quite hard to raise external capital because of the structuring. There's also consumer-owned firms, and there's a few examples of those. Some cooperatives are consumer-owned, and again, decision-making might be slower in these kind of structures. There's another sort of academic part to look at, which is market contracting costs versus ownership costs. So in terms of market contracting costs, these are the costs that refer to what's happening in the business, in the market. Things like market power. A firm may gain market power through its large scale or monopoly regulations that limit competition. A lock-in cost. This is a follow-on from market power. So firms that have market power may use this power to lock in various forms of stakeholders, from investors to suppliers. And for example, suppliers can be dependent on the business of a single large firm. So can you suggest some reasons to support the argument that investor ownership might be preferable in a lock-in situation? So I think an interesting example of a lock-in situation is kind of like these mega firms like Walmart, ShopRite, etc., where they really set the price and a lot of farmers and suppliers only sell to them. The risks of long-term contracting are also market costs, information asymmetry and moral hazard. That becomes a problem when one party to the contract has more information than the other, and this is a cost when you're contracting in a market. And then difficulties communicating may also lead to inefficient contracting or inefficient contracting process, which is also a market contracting cost. And then there are ownership costs. Remember that ownership has two main features. We've said it in a slide before, I think the first slide in this unit. The exercise of control and the receipt of residual earnings. Therefore, the costs of ownership really depend on those two features. And the cost of ownership can be divided into the cost of controlling managers, the cost of collective decision making, and the cost of risk bearing. We spoke about the chair earlier, and I love the chair example because it really demonstrates the importance of specialization. Farmer and Jensen see the separation of ownership and control as a separation of decision-making and risk-bearing functions. They contend that organizations not only benefit from the specialization in management and risk-bearing, but also from a common approach between the managers and the owners to controlling agency problems resulting from this separation. And that's really what corporate governance does. It tries to align the interests of the owners and the managers. And this is an interesting Bible verse. Indeed, it's a story that Jesus tells about monitoring managers, and I think it's Warren Buffett in his 2002 letter that says that both the ability and fidelity of managers have long needed monitoring, citing this example that indeed nearly 2,000 years ago Jesus Christ addressed this subject approvingly of a certain rich man who told his manager, "Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be a steward." We always end up back in ownership or back to ownership when we're talking about corporate governance. So shareholders or owners delegate their executive power to managers who actually run the business. However, management objectives can be potentially in conflict to those shareholders. And these conflicts may concern business strategy, can concern financial decision making. So, for example, structure or the amount of executive compensation, and we have a huge unit on that coming up. There's also these agency conflicts constitute a key issue with respect to corporate governance. The quality of shareholder control of these managers is actually essential for good governance. So in terms of, I promised that we're going to talk about VC and how VC firms and some of the unconventional developments in corporate governance have evolved. And I love this picture, turn ideas into reality. And then I think that that's what startups, VC funded startups do. The rise of institutions as the dominant form of investors, the increasing popularity of employee ownership, producer-owned cooperatives, and widespread state ownership kind of challenge us to evolve our thinking around corporate governance and take a wider view of ownership and contracting. These are significant because they affect the level of contracting and ownership costs. And of course, that affects the governance arrangements of these firms. The first big change is the era of the institutional investor, so a professional investor. And the rise of institutional investors has created almost like a three-way, well, you get my picture, like triangle, right? A three-way separation of ownership and control. And that is number one, the shareholders. Number two, the indirect shareholders, so the institutional investors, fund portfolio managers. And then number three, the executives or the managers. So I'm just going to have another sip of water. So one of the major changes that institutional professional investors, like your pension funds, like your hedge funds, like your sort of big institutions, so corporates that have investment departments, etc., have brought about, is a change in investment strategy. So majority of institutional investors, okay, this doesn't include hedge funds, mainly around pension funds. The majority of institutional investors, like pension funds, take a passive investment stance. So they just want to match the standard index returns. And this actually contrasts with active investors that aim for better than market returns. So you can see a difference in the amount of risk that both sets of people will be willing to take. And you can also see where there can be even more conflicts, because now there's potentially three groups of people that may want slightly different things from an investment or from a job for the executives. Enter venture capital, the tech bros. So joint ownership refers to the sharing of ownership rights between a capital-constrained entrepreneur and a number of venture capitalists who are willing to finance the entrepreneur, contingent on the firm's performance. So these venture capitalists, in venture capital, we have a strong incentive to maximize value, but few benefits of control. So as a venture capitalist, you'll be taking a maximum probably of maybe 30% of the company, but usually around 5, 10. I think Y Combinator takes about 7%. So you have a strong incentive to maximize value, but don't really have full control of the company. This is really contrast with the private equity firm, which would have much fuller control of the company. So consequently, they have significant agency costs when it comes to monitoring entrepreneurs. And venture capital firms are actually set up, the portfolio management departments are set up to monitor entrepreneurs, but also help those entrepreneurs grow. So according to Kaplan and Stromberg, the monitoring and the agency costs are managed in 3 different ways. Sophisticated contracting. So venture capital actually sort of popularized a lot of interesting types of contract. The safe notes, for instance, convertible notes, which were around before venture capital but became popular with venture capital, and the system of pro rata rights, liquidity clauses, anti-dilution clauses, etc. The contracts that sort of venture capitalists give to entrepreneurs can be quite sophisticated, and that's because of these constraints and these issues that I've mentioned. Downside protection will always be a trend in venture capital. The second part is very strict pre-investment screening. So the pitch competitions, the sort of, deal flow. I mean, venture capital firms will probably invest, sometimes the numbers are astronomical. So sometimes they'll be looking at one deal for every 50 pitch decks that they look at. So very, very sophisticated pre-investment screening. And then number 3 is post-investment monitoring and advice. So a lot of venture capital firms, including ours, have quite sophisticated portfolio management, monitoring and advisory services, to the extent that we do digital marketing for our portfolio companies, we do business development and HR services for our portfolio companies. So post-investment monitoring and advising is also something that venture capital firms do because of this quite unique structure. The equity involvement of venture capitalists provides an incentive for them to engage in costly support activities to enhance the value of the venture, or at least to limit potential losses, and that's been exactly my experience. Of course, state-owned enterprises are another sort of up and coming structure. Well, would I say up and coming? I mean popular, particularly in China. And one of the things about state-owned enterprises is that they're different from private enterprises. And they face a soft budget constraint. So whether private or state-owned enterprises would have little pressure or little incentive to take these financial pressures seriously. So companies like South African Airways in Africa, they're always losing money because they're not really incentivized to act efficiently, since there's always going to be sort of a government bailout. This might be called moral hazard. Cooperatives, particularly in Italy, show that workers actually in a cooperative, like I explained before, are more motivated and aligned. However, it's much harder to attract external investment, and there are large costs because everybody has to agree. And when you're trying to get 1,000 people to agree on a decision making takes much longer.